Sophie Gardner pulled her thin blue hoodie tighter around herself as she stepped out of Brood Awakening, the small coffee shop where she had just finished an exhausting 8-hour shift. The November air had turned crisp, biting through the fabric as she made her way toward the bus stop. It had been a long day, 3 morning classes, followed by non-stop hours behind the espresso machine. Her feet ached, her shoulders felt stiff, and she was too tired to think about anything other than getting home. The number 42 bus pulled up right on time, its headlights cutting through the early evening darkness. Sophie climbed aboard, flashing her monthly pass at the driver, a gruff, middle-aged man who barely acknowledged her. With a relieved sigh, she slumped into a seat near the back, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window. The city lights blurred together as exhaustion settled into her bones. Just as the doors began to close, a voice called out, "Wait!" The driver groaned but reopened the doors. A young man, slightly out of breath, stepped inside. He looked to be in his early 20s, dressed in jeans and a simple gray sweater, plain yet oddly refined, as if it belonged to someone used to finer things. His dark hair was tousled by the wind, and his posture carried an effortless confidence that made several passengers glance up. "That'll be $3.50, the driver said flatly. The young man patted his pockets, his face shifting from mild concern to something closer to panic. I think I left my wallet in my other jacket," he admitted, his voice quiet but clear. The driver barely looked at him. "No money, no ride." Sophie watched the exchange, recognizing that look of embarrassment all too well. She had been there before, counting out change at a grocery store, hoping she had enough, or apologizing when her card got declined at the pharmacy. Without giving it a second thought, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a few coins. "Here," she said, holding out $3.50. The young man turned, his hazel eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, he hesitated, as if about to refuse. But then, his expression softened, and he nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he said, taking the money. "I'll pay you back somehow." Sophie shrugged. "Don't worry about it." She gave him a tired smile before settling back into her seat. The young man found a spot a few rows ahead. Occasionally, he glanced back at Sophie, his expression thoughtful. But Sophie barely noticed. Her mind was already preoccupied with tomorrow's exam and the nagging worry about whether her mother had remembered to take her medication. What she couldn't possibly know was that the man she had just helped was Ethan Carter, heir to the Carter Grand Hotels, a luxury empire spanning 3 continents. His face had appeared in business magazines, alongside articles speculating about when he would take over the family empire. But here, on this ordinary city bus, none of that mattered. As the bus rumbled through the streets, 2 lives that had once seemed worlds apart briefly intersected. Neither of them realized that this small, seemingly insignificant moment would change everything. The morning rush at Brood Awakening was in full swing. The scent of freshly ground coffee beans and warm pastries filled the air as customers lined up, desperate for their caffeine fix before the workday began. Sophie Gardner moved with practiced efficiency, steaming milk, grinding beans, and pouring perfect lattes, her hands working on autopilot despite her exhaustion. "Grande caramel latte with almond milk," she called out, sliding the cup across the counter without looking up. "Thanks," a familiar voice replied. Sophie glanced up and froze. Standing before her was the young man from the bus, the one she had helped the night before. In the bright light of day, she noticed things she hadn't before. His features were sharper, his jawline defined. His clothes, though simple, had that unmistakable look of quiet luxury. And his eyes, hazel, intelligent, and amused, watched her with a hint of curiosity. "It's you," she said, surprised. He smiled. "I told you I'd pay you back for the $3.50. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You didn't have to come all this way for that." "Maybe I wanted good coffee, too." His voice carried a playful edge. "I'm Ethan, by the way." "Sophie," she answered automatically. Before she could say more, her coworker Lisa nudged her. "We've got 6 people waiting on drinks," Lisa hissed. "Right, sorry." Sophie turned back to Ethan. "I need to." "Of course," he said, dropping a $5 bill into the tip jar. "Thanks again, Sophie." She watched as he took a seat by the window, pulling out a book instead of a phone. Something about that struck her as refreshing. Throughout her shift, she caught him glancing up occasionally, their eyes meeting for brief moments before they both looked away. When the morning rush finally died down, Sophie grabbed a rag and began wiping nearby tables. "So," she said, approaching Ethan's table, "do you make a habit of forgetting your wallet?" He chuckled, closing his book. "Not usually." "Yesterday was unusual." "How so?" He hesitated, as if debating how much to share. "Let's just say I'm trying something different with my life." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Mysterious." "Not intentionally," he said with a small smile. Then, his expression turned more serious. "I actually came back because," he hesitated again. "This might sound strange, but you're the first person who's done something nice for me without expecting anything in return." Sophie frowned slightly. "It was just bus fare." "Still," Ethan said, meeting her eyes, "I'd like to thank you properly. Maybe coffee sometime? When you're not working." Sophie studied him, trying to read his intentions. There was something he wasn't saying, but his eyes seemed genuine. "I don't even know you," she said carefully. "That's the point of coffee, isn't it?" Ethan countered. "To get to know someone?" Before she could answer, her manager called from behind the counter. "Sophie, break's over." She turned back to Ethan. "I'm here most mornings," he said quickly. "Think about it." Sophie nodded hesitantly before returning to work. Throughout the day, she found herself glancing at the spot where he had sat, now occupied by a student with headphones. She told herself it was ridiculous to feel disappointed when he didn't show up the next day. But when he appeared the following morning, casually ordering a black coffee and asking how her day was going, something warm flickered to life inside her chest. What had started as a coincidence was quickly becoming a routine. What Sophie didn't realize was just how complicated that routine would become. Sophie Gardner stirred her latte absent-mindedly, watching the steam curl into the air. Across from her, Ethan Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. It was their 5th coffee meetup in 2 weeks, this time after her shift had ended. What had begun as a chance encounter had quickly turned into a comfortable routine. "So, let me get this straight," Sophie said, tilting her head. "You just decided to quit your corporate job and start over?" Ethan smiled, running a hand through his dark hair. "Something like that." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "That's vague." He exhaled, as if choosing his words carefully. "The family business wasn't who I wanted to be." Sophie nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. "My dad was like that. Had my whole life planned out, college, law school, working at his firm. When I chose art history instead, he cut me off." She shrugged, forcing a lightness into her voice. "Haven't spoken to him in 3 years." Ethan leaned forward. "That's rough. Is that why you work so many hours here?" "That, and helping my mom with rent. She has health issues." Sophie surprised herself with how easily the words slipped out. Something about Ethan made it easy to be honest. Anyway, enough about my sad backstory, she said, setting her cup down. What are you doing now? Job-wise? Ethan hesitated. Freelance consulting. That's another way of saying unemployed, Sophie teased. He laughed. It's complicated. Sophie narrowed her eyes playfully. Mr. Mysterious strikes again. Ethan smirked. I'd rather hear more about your passion for Renaissance art. She rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. Smooth deflection. The coffee shop had emptied out as the evening wore on. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting a golden glow onto the sidewalk. Sophie should have been heading home. She had reading to finish for class, but she found herself reluctant to leave. Can I ask you something? Ethan's tone turned serious. Depends on the question. What do you want? He asked, his voice quiet but intent. Like, really want out of life? Sophie blinked, caught off guard. I want to finish my degree. Get a job at a museum. Maybe curate my own exhibition someday. She hesitated. And not worry about money constantly. That would be nice. That's it? Ethan asked, studying her. No dreams of world travel or mansions. Sophie chuckled. Those things cost money I don't have. She paused. But if money weren't an issue, I'd take my mom to Italy. She's always wanted to see Florence. She tilted her head. Your turn. What do you want, Ethan, whatever your last name is? Ethan smiled, but there was something unreadable in his expression. Freedom. To just be me. Not what others expect. Sophie held his gaze. And who is the real you? He hesitated for half a second too long. I'm still figuring that out, he admitted. But I feel more like myself when I'm with you than I have in a long time. The confession hung between them, honest and unguarded. Sophie felt a flutter in her chest, excitement mixed with something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. I should go, she said finally, gathering her things. Early class tomorrow. Ethan nodded, standing as well. Same time next week? Maybe sooner, she replied before she could second-guess herself. There's a student exhibition at my college Friday night. Nothing fancy, but I'd love to go, Ethan said immediately. As they parted ways outside, Sophie realized something. For the first time in years, she was letting someone new into her carefully constructed world. She wasn't sure if it was wise. But something about Ethan made her want to take the risk. What she didn't see was the way Ethan's face changed after she left, the conflict, the guilt shadowing his features. And she certainly didn't see him pull out his phone, much more expensive than his simple clothes suggested, and stare at the name flashing on the screen. The truth was coming. Whether Ethan wanted it to or not. Sophie's shift at Brood Awakening ran later than usual. A coworker had called in sick, leaving her to close alone. The coffee shop was nearly empty now, the only sound the soft hum of the espresso machine as she wiped down the counter. To her surprise, Ethan was still there. He had been nursing a series of coffees for hours, typing away on his laptop at his usual table by the window. You didn't have to wait, she said, untying her apron. I wanted to. Ethan closed his laptop and stretched. Besides, it's late. I thought I'd walk you to the bus stop. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the crisp scent of autumn. Their shoulders brushed occasionally as they walked, neither seeming to mind. You know what I realized today? Ethan asked, breaking the comfortable silence. What's that? It's been exactly 1 month since you saved me on the bus. Sophie laughed. Saved you? It was $3.50. It was more than that. Ethan's voice softened. That day, I was trying something new, stepping away from, he hesitated. From expectations. You were the first person who didn't look at me and see. See what? Sophie prompted when he didn't continue. Ethan shook his head. It doesn't matter. Sophie was about to press him when a voice from inside the shop called out. Ethan? They turned. A middle-aged man in a suit stood near the counter, squinting as if trying to place him. Then, recognition dawned. No way, the man said, pulling out his phone. Ethan's body went rigid. A woman's voice cut through the room. Ethan Carter? Sophie turned to see a journalist, sharp-eyed, phone already in hand, a press badge clipped to her coat. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and amusement. Sophie blinked. Carter? As in Carter Grand Hotels? She turned back to Ethan, her stomach twisting. The journalist smirked. Does your father know you're slumming it in coffee shops? Is this some kind of publicity stunt? Sophie barely registered the cappuccino overflowing behind the counter, hot milk spilling onto the surface. Ethan Carter, she repeated, the name tasting foreign on her tongue. The journalist's eyes widened as she glanced between them. Oh, this is rich. Literally. She turned to Sophie. Honey, do you work here? How long have you known who he really is? Sophie felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. Lisa, her coworker, had been listening from the back. She stepped forward, arms crossed. You're that Ethan Carter? Ethan swallowed hard. Sophie, I can explain. Lisa let out a scoff. Wow. And here I thought the watch was fake. Sophie stepped back, barely able to process what was happening. Were you ever going to tell me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan reached for her hand. Yes. I didn't know how. The right time was before I fell for you, Sophie said, her voice breaking, not after everyone else figured it out. Without another word, she untied her apron and walked toward the staff room, the door closing behind her. Only then did she allow the tears to fall. Ethan Carter stood on the marble balcony of his family's estate, staring at the manicured gardens below. The evening air was cool, but he barely noticed. 3 days had passed since Sophie had walked out of his life, and with each passing hour, the weight of his deception grew heavier. Behind him, the heavy doors opened, and his father's familiar voice broke the silence. I told you it wouldn't work, Richard Carter said, stepping forward, a glass of scotch in his hand. Playing at being ordinary. Ethan didn't turn around. I wasn't playing at anything. Richard let out a dry chuckle. No? Then what would you call abandoning your responsibilities to pour coffee and chase after some girl? Ethan clenched his jaw. Her name is Sophie. And she's nothing like us, Richard continued, unfazed. You think you can just walk away from this life? From the company? The board meeting is tomorrow. The Singapore expansion won't wait for your identity crisis to resolve itself. I'm not coming back, Dad. Richard set his glass down with a sharp clink. Oh, you think you're not coming back? But you will. You're still legally bound to this company. Unless, of course, you'd rather have a courtroom battle over every cent you've ever spent during your little experiment. Ethan's stomach twisted. You wouldn't do that. Richard smirked. Try me. You're either my son, or you're just another problem I need to solve. Ethan turned back toward the view, exhaling slowly. He had spent his whole life living under his father's expectations. Every decision had been mapped out for him before he even had a chance to make his own. "Sophie saw me," Ethan said, almost to himself. "Not my last name. Not the money. Just me." Richard scoffed. "And now she's seen all of it, and she wants nothing to do with you." He walked toward the doors. "That's reality, son. People either want you for your wealth or resent you for having it. There's no in between." Ethan stayed silent, his hands gripping the balcony railing. "The helicopter leaves at 9 a.m., Richard said as he left the balcony. "Be on it." When the footsteps faded, Ethan pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over Sophie's contact, but what could he possibly say to fix this? Instead, he powered off the phone, turned, and walked inside. 2 weeks later, Sophie sat across from her mother at their small kitchen table, stirring her soup absent-mindedly. "You're quiet tonight," Maria observed. Sophie shrugged. "Busy day." Maria gave her a knowing look. "Is it about the boy?" Sophie nearly dropped her spoon. "Mom, please. You check business news websites daily, you barely date, and sometimes, you say his name in your sleep." Maria reached across the table, placing her hand over Sophie's. "You're still thinking about him." Sophie sighed, leaning back. "I hate that I am." Maria smiled gently. "Maybe it's time to find out why." That night, after finishing an assignment, Sophie idly scrolled through a business news site. A headline caught her eye. "Heir resigns, walks away from billion-dollar empire." Her heart pounded as she read the article. Ethan had officially severed ties with his family's company. He had given up everything. But where had he gone? And why did she still care? The Pinewood Lodge sat nestled against the mountains, its weathered wooden signs swinging gently in the breeze. The place had none of the polished grandeur of the Carter Grand Hotels, no marble floors, no crystal chandeliers. Instead, it had something more authentic, a charm that couldn't be manufactured. Sophie stood at the edge of the gravel parking lot, her overnight bag clutched tightly in one hand. Doubt gnawed at her. What if Ethan didn't want to see her? What if he had moved on? What if this entire trip was a mistake? Before she could reconsider, the lodge's front door swung open, and a family stepped out, laughing as they headed toward their car. Sophie took a deep breath and walked forward. Inside, the reception area smelled of pine and fresh coffee. A stone fireplace crackled warmly in the corner, and hiking maps covered one wall. Behind the desk, a gray-bearded man looked up as she entered. "Welcome to Pinewood," he greeted. "Checking in?" Actually, Sophie hesitated. "I'm looking for someone who works here." "Ethan Carter." The man's expression shifted slightly, becoming guarded. "And you are?" "Sophie Gardner," she said. "I'm a friend." Before he could respond, a door behind the desk opened. Ethan walked out, carrying a stack of fresh towels. He was dressed differently than she was used to, flannel shirt, sturdy boots, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms dusted with sawdust. He froze when he saw her. The towels nearly slipped from his grasp. "Sophie," he breathed. She drank in the sight of him. His hair was longer, his face more tanned. He looked different. Not like a billionaire playing at being poor, but like someone who had truly let go of his old life. For the first time since stepping off the bus, she wasn't sure what to say. The older man glanced between them. "Take your break, Ethan. I'll cover the desk." Neither of them spoke as Ethan led her outside to a small patio overlooking the mountains. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, turning everything golden. "You found me," Ethan said finally, leaning against the wooden railing. "James told me where you were," Sophie admitted. "I almost didn't come." "I'm glad you did." Ethan's hazel eyes searched hers. "Why did you?" Sophie looked out at the mountains, gathering her thoughts. "I needed to know if any of it was real." "Us, I mean." Ethan didn't hesitate. "All of it was real, except the parts one didn't tell you." A silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Sophie turned to face him directly. "If money doesn't define you, then what does?" Ethan's expression softened, a small smile forming at the corner of his mouth. "Who I choose to be." The simple answer lingered in the cool mountain air. And for the first time in months, Sophie wasn't sure whether she had come for closure. Life has a way of surprising us, often when we least expect it. Sophie and Ethan's journey is a reminder that true connections aren't built on wealth, status, or carefully crafted appearances. They are built on honesty, trust, and the willingness to be vulnerable. Many of us, at some point, have worn masks to fit into expectations, whether from society, family, or even ourselves. But as Ethan learned, no amount of pretending can replace the feeling of being truly seen and accepted for who we are. Sophie's story teaches us that trust, once broken, is not easily repaired, but with time, understanding, and effort, second chances are possible. For those who have lived through decades of relationships, career changes, and personal struggles, this story serves as a powerful reminder: life is not about perfection, but about the choices we make to seek truth, forgiveness, and genuine happiness. No matter our age, it's never too late to redefine what truly matters and to open our hearts to new beginnings.